The final insult wasn't the silence on Christmas Day. It wasn't the empty space at their dinner table where my presence used to be a given. It was the email that arrived the next morning on Boxing Day as a pale winter sun struggled to climb over the frozen harbor. The subject line read, "Outstanding balance, Port Blossom property." My own son Ethan had sent me an invoice. The amount calculated down to the last cent was $47,852.89 for renovations on the historic colonial home I had bought for him, the home he and his family had lived in for nearly a decade, rent-free at 76. I thought the world had exhausted its capacity to shock me. I was wrong. What I did next involved no raised voices, no tearful phone calls, no satisfying fantasies of revenge. I simply remembered who I was before I became his mother, reminded them, who held the deed, and quietly, methodically began to dismantle the world they had built on the foundation of my love. I sat alone at my small kitchen table, the lonely Christmas dinner from the night before, a ghost in the air, a single plate, a single glass outside my condo window. The waters of sound were a sheet of hammered pewter across the harbor in the historic district of Port Blossom. Their house was likely still glowing, filled with the warmth of a new espresso machine and the debris of expensive gifts. I could picture my grandson Leo asleep upstairs, clutching the wooden train set. Was sure they had bought him. The thought brought a familiar ache, a phantom limb of grandmotherly affection for years. The rhythm of my life had been set to their needs. Now there was only silence, a vast unbroken quiet that had become the soundtrack to my days. The shift had been gradual, a slow erosion of warmth over years. It began with missed calls, then birthdays celebrated without me, then holidays where my invitation felt like an afterthought. I had made excuses for them, for myself. They're busy, the children are a handful, Claire is overwhelmed. I had accepted the shrinking space they allotted me, believing that to object would be to intrude, to be a burden. I had made myself smaller and smaller to fit their new life until I had nearly disappeared. I took a slow sip of coffee. It tasted bitter. That's the unnerving bargain of old age. You trade authority for invisibility. I once managed administrative chaos of the entire Port Blossom shipyard, a place of steel and sweat and unforgiving deadlines. I negotiated contracts, managed payroll for hundreds of men, and knew how to stare down a union boss without flinching. Now I was just a name on a tax form, a relic whose only remaining function, it seemed, was to sign checks. I didn't weep. The capacity for that kind of hot, immediate grief had been hollowed out of me. What remained was something colder, clearer, a stillness. Ethan hadn't just forgotten me. He had reclassified me. I was no longer family. I was a resource. A line of credit had finally decided to call in that night, after I'd rinsed my loan plate and stared out at the indifferent blinking of a distant lighthouse. I understood this wasn't about a renovation. Bill, this was about erasure. And I would not be erased. This story isn't about the bitterness of being forgotten, about what happens when a woman stops waiting to be seen and decides to see herself. 2 days after Christmas, I woke to the same pale sun. The email from Ethan remained unanswered, a digital specter in my inbox. I opened it again, forcing myself to read past the falsely cheerful greeting. "Hi, Mom. Hope you had a nice holiday. Claire and I meant to touch base, but things have been a whirlwind. A whirlwind, that's what they called it." Attached was the invoice, a meticulously itemized spreadsheet. Exterior paint, Heritage. Colors, $12,500. Master bath remodel, Italian marble, 1,000. Custom wine cellar installation, 9,700. Corporate memo. He had never asked. He had simply acted confident in the knowledge that I would absorb the cost, as I had absorbed every other slight, every other disappointment that had always been the unspoken contract between us. From the moment he was a boy, he knew I would be his safety net. Business venture, a mountain of student debt, a reckless car purchase. I was always there to quietly, lovingly break his fall, because that's what mothers did. But this wasn't a scraped knee. This was a violation, dressed in politeness. I closed the laptop. My hands were rock steady on the cool metal. Traveled back to the day I bought that house. Ethan had just been laid off from a promising finance job, and Claire's small boutique was struggling with a baby on the way. They were terrified. I had just taken my retirement from the shipyard. My finances were secure, not extravagant, but solid to protect them, to give my future grandchild a stable home. I bought the house in my name. The deed was mine. A fact Ethan readily agreed to at the time, citing his own financial complications. The agreement was verbal, sealed by love and trust. They would live there, care for it, and someday when the time was right would sign it over. Now I saw that day through a different lens. He hadn't seen my offer as a lifeline. He'd seen it as an investment. He had been playing the long game, waiting for me to become too old, too tired, or too sentimental to remember the terms. But he had miscalculated. I was not too old to recognize betrayal, and I was not too tired to defend myself. That evening I printed the invoice and pinned it to the corkboard in my small study. The number 47,000 stared back at me in bold black ink. It wasn't just a bill, it was a ransom note for a relationship that was already dead. Inside me began to coalesce, not into rage but into resolve. A decision was forming, one that had nothing to do with paying an invoice, and everything to do with remembering my own name. The house Ethan lived in was a part of my own history. I remembered the day we first saw it, a proud but neglected colonial with peeling paint and floors that sighed with every step, but Ethan had looked at the grand staircase and the high ceilings with stars in his eyes. Claire had squeezed my arm, whispering about the garden she could plant out back. They were young, scared, but full of dreams. My own dream was simpler: to see them safe. I handled the down payment and the closing costs. I put the deed solely in my name, to shield the asset from Ethan's known financial recklessness. I never charged them $1 of rent for nearly 10 years. I quietly paid the property taxes, a significant sum in a historic district like Port Blossom, never sending them a bill, never asking for a thank you. I considered it my contribution, the invisible scaffolding that held up their life in the beginning. It felt right. I was a constant presence, helping paint the nursery, babysitting, bringing over Sunday dinners. I was Grandma Mom, the steady anchor in their chaotic lives. Then the slow fade began. Dinners were canceled. Calls went unreturned. I learned about Leo's first steps from a post on social media. I told myself I was giving them space, that I wasn't a mother who clung. I retreated with a grace I thought was noble, but now saw was merely convenient for them. I sat at my desk late into the night, the house file open before me. Receipts, tax statements, the original deed, my name, Genevieve Sterling, was there in clear, authoritative script. No one else's. It struck me with the force of a physical blow. They hadn't just renovated a house, they had renovated the past, erasing the memory of my sacrifice and replacing it with a narrative of their own hard work and success. They lived in my house on my generosity and had the audacity to bill me for the privilege. I leaned back, the leather of my old desk chair creaking, the pieces clicked into place. Ethan had never wanted a mother, he'd wanted a benefactor, and now that he believed my utility had expired, he was ready to cash in the policy. He was wrong that night. Sleep was a foreign country. My mind was a flurry of sharp, focused activity, reviewing a decade of quiet concessions and loud assumptions. I wasn't thinking about what they had done. I was planning what I would do, and because I still held the deed, I still had a voice, and for the first time in a very long time, I was going to use both. 3 days after receiving the invoice, I drove to Port Blossom. I parked across the street from the house beneath the skeletal branches of a great oak tree. The house looked beautiful. The new paint was a tasteful slate blue, the shutters a crisp white. A tasteful, expensive wreath hung on the front door. It looked like a home from a magazine, a life I had financed but was not welcome in. I didn't intend to get out of the car, but as I sat there, the side gate opened, and Claire emerged with Leo. He was bundled in a tiny navy peacoat. She was speaking on her phone, her voice sharp and annoyed. She didn't see me as they walked down the sidewalk. I could hear her clearly, through my slight open window. "No, I know, but he's impossible," she said into the phone. "Ethan thinks his mother will just write the check. She always does. Honestly, it's the least she can do. We've been taking care of her house for years. It's practically our money anyway. She laughed a short, brittle sound. I watched until they turned the corner. My blood ran cold. Her house, the casual venomous entitlement of it. The way she framed their decade of free housing. As a burden they had generously shouldered it. Wasn't just ingratitude. It was a complete perversion of reality. They had convinced themselves they were the victim. I started the car, my hands steady on the wheel. There was no more room for doubt. No more space for sentimentality. This was no longer a family matter. It was a legal one. Back at my condo, I found the business card of a man I'd met years ago, through the shipyard. A friend of a friend. Alistair Finch. Property and estate law. Known for being methodical, unshakable and discreet. I called his office and made an appointment for the following morning. That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept soundly. I wasn't thinking about what Ethan had said, or what Claire believed. I was thinking about what I was about to do. I was no longer grieving a relationship I was preparing to reclaim, an asset. The next morning, I took the train 2 towns over. Before my appointment, I walked down to the old shipyard. It was mostly modernized now, but the old administrative building, where I'd worked for 35 years, a stubborn brick sentinel against the sea. I stood at the end of the long pier, the raw winter wind whipping at my coat, the air thick with the smell of salt and diesel. This place remembered me here. I wasn't a mother or grandmother. I was Genevieve Sterling, the woman who could untangle a snarled shipping schedule, who knew every line of the union contract by heart, and who had once stared down a corporate lawyer from Boston and made him blink first. I had forgotten that woman in the quiet servitude of family. I had let her go dormant. I closed my eyes and breathed in the cold, sharp air, opened them. I felt her stirring inside me again. Alistair Finch's office was on the top floor of a historic brick building, smelling of old books and lemon polish. He was a man in his late 60s, with kind eyes and a spine of iron. He listened to my story without interruption, his face impassive as I let the timeline, the purchase, the verbal agreement, the years of paying taxes, the invoice when I finished. He didn't offer platitudes. He simply asked, "What is your desired outcome, Mrs. Sterling?" "I want them out of my house," I said, my voice even, "and I want the property sold." "Then that is what we will do," said, legally, respectfully, and with unimpeachable documentation. He smiled faintly. "I trust you have records." "I have everything," I said. He leaned back. "Excellent. Then let us begin." Walking out of his office, I felt no malice, no glee. I felt a quiet, powerful sense of order being restored. This wasn't an act of revenge. It was an act of correction. I had given them a decade of shelter, security, and silence. I had trusted them to honor the gift they hadn't, so now I would simply and formally take it back. The 2 weeks following my meeting with Alistair Finch passed in a state of calm resolve. I lived my life, watered my plants, and spoke to no one of the storm I had set in motion. The silence no longer felt like loneliness. It felt like strategy. Alistair worked with quiet efficiency. The first step was not an eviction notice, but a formal letter sent via certified mail. It was a masterpiece of neutral legal prose. It stated that I, as the sole title holder, was conducting a review of the property's occupancy. It noted the absence of a formal lease, and that their tenancy had been a conditional family arrangement. It concluded by requesting a meeting to discuss the future of the property. It was a polite, professional, and utterly terrifying declaration that my silence was over. Confirmation of receipt arrived 3 days later. Claire had signed for it. I waited for 4 days. Nothing. Then a letter arrived. Not from Ethan, but from a law firm in Port Blossom. It was a short, vaguely threatening letter, referencing their long-term occupancy and invested equity. Alistair was unperturbed. "A predictable opening move. They're testing your resolve." Our response was swift and surgical. We reiterated the facts. My sole ownership, the decade of rent-free living, my sole payment of all property taxes. We enclosed copies of 10 years of my canceled checks to the town tax office, and at the bottom we included a preliminary notice to quit giving them 90 days to vacate the premises. It was not a suggestion. It was the beginning of a legal countdown. I signed my name, Genevieve Sterling. my hand as steady as the Thai evening. I did not pace or worry. I sat in my quiet living room and realized I was for the first time in years making a decision entirely for myself, not to keep the peace, not to manage anyone's feelings, not to be a good mother, just for me. Somewhere across the harbor, Ethan and Claire were reading that letter. They had wanted me to be invisible. Now they were seeing me in the stark, unavoidable clarity of the law. The first crack in their armor appeared a week later. It was Claire who came to my door, her face a carefully constructed mask of wounded indignation. She stood on my doorstep, not asking to come in, and spoke of how disappointed and blindsided they were. "We're family, Genevieve," she said, her voice laced with accusation. I looked at her, at this woman, who had lived in my house, who had laughed about my financial utility, and felt a profound weariness. "Family doesn't send invoices," said softly. She had no reply. She left, and from then on, all communication came through the lawyers. Their attorney requested mediation. I agreed on the condition. It was held at Alistair's office. I arrived 5 minutes early, dressed in a simple navy dress and a pearl necklace Arthur had given me on our 20th anniversary. Ethan arrived late, looking haggard. His lawyer spoke of misunderstandings and the emotional investment my son had in the home. I listened patiently. Then, Alistair laid out the terms. The house would be listed for sale. Immediately they would have 60 days to vacate. Given their lack of any financial investment, no rent, no mortgage payments, no taxes, they would receive nothing from the proceeds. The renovations they undertook were at their own discretion and expense. Ethan finally spoke, his voice tight with disbelief. "We thought you didn't need the money. We assumed you were happy." "Help." That word, assumed. Your assumptions are not my responsibility, Ethan, I said, my voice quiet, but caring. Across the polished mahogany table, "I am alone, but I am not oblivious." For the first time, he looked at me, truly looked at me, and I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not remorse, recognition. The recognition that the woman he thought he knew was gone. The sale of the house was swift. The market in Port Blossom was strong, and a beautifully renovated historic colonial was in high demand. A closing date was set in the interim. A quiet settled over the proceedings. There were no more angles, no more dramatic visits, just the slow, methodical process of untangling. During those weeks, I rediscovered the rhythm of my own life. I joined a memoir writing workshop at the local community college. I sat in a room with other women my age, women with their own stories of love and loss, of being overlooked and finding their strength. We didn't offer advice. We offered witness. We listened. When it was my turn, I didn't tell the whole story. I told a piece of it. I wrote about the shipyard, about the satisfying heft of a well-kept ledger, about the feeling of bringing order to chaos, the quiet power of competence. The instructor, a kind woman with bright, intelligent eyes, told me I had a narrator's voice. "People want to listen to you," she said. The day of the closing, I met Alistair at the title office. As I signed the final documents, my name flowing from the pen in a steady, confident script, I felt a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying lift from my shoulders. It wasn't the house. It was the narrative. I was no longer a character in their story, the difficult mother, the out-of-touch relic. I was the author of my own. On the way out, I saw them, Ethan and Claire, standing in lobby waiting to sign their own papers. They looked smaller, diminished. We did not speak. I gave them a slight formal nod and walked past them, out into the bright, cold air of a world that was now entirely my own. The check from the sale arrived a week later. I didn't open it. Right away I placed it on my desk and went to my writing workshop. That evening, I wrote the first line of a new story. It began, "There is a difference between being alone and being abandoned. One is a circumstance, the other is a choice." A few months later, a postcard arrived. A picture of a generic southwestern landscape. On the back, in Ethan's hasty script, were 5 words: "Hope you are doing well." It wasn't an apology. It was a feeler, a test, to see if the door was still open. I looked at it for a long moment, then placed it in a drawer with his invoice. I did not need to respond. My life was no longer defined by his actions, my own. I had filled the space he had vacated, not with anger or grief, but with myself. with new friends from my class, with long walks by the sea, with the quiet, satisfying work of putting my own story into words. It struck me then that we tell women their value is in what they hold together, homes, traditions. But there is a fierce, quiet power in choosing to let go. There is a victory in walking away with your peace and your name intact. I had chosen myself, not out of spite, but out of necessity, and in that choice, I had found not an ending, but a beginning. The real closing wasn't on a house, it was on a version of myself, who believed that love had to be silent and unconditional. My love now had conditions. It required respect, and it began with me.